Okay. Hello and welcome back. Today's conversation on gender justice for present times, impact of connected aspirational mobility in rural society is about understanding inequalities, its evolution in current times, and its impact on building a just and equal rural India tomorrow. Today, across the board, as civil society actors, policymakers, market leaders, and members of the community at large, we agree that gender shapes our relationship with ourselves, within our households, with the community, with the market, and with the government. Particularly in the context of rural India, concentrated efforts continue to be made to challenge gender norms by creating a conducive ecosystem that enables the creation of a just and equal rural society. With the rising popularity of voice and video platforms, the internet is heavily influencing rural culture, perceptions, opportunities, and aspirations. The emerging culture in villages will inevitably contribute to rural India's engagement with politics, development, policy, and governance. Therefore, critical to the transformative agenda for rural is a nuanced analysis of the discourse around gender justice in present times. We need to ensure that the approaches undertaken for transformation do not reinforce patriarchal norms, structures, and inequities, but eliminate them. At TRI, the Unit on Inclusion and Equality brings together practitioners, researchers, policymakers, academics, administrators, and other experts to build exchange of ideas, shape narrative in shaping discourse for just and equal society with conditions for every person to express their potential. In the spirit of our shared quest for a just and equitable society, it is my pleasure to welcome today's panel that has come together to share insights and learnings from their diverse professional experience. The conversation will be moderated by Suneeta Dhar. She has over 4 decades of experience in policy advocacy and programming in advancing women's rights. She has previously worked with United Nations Development Fund for Women and also been the director of Jagori. Suneeta was recognized recently by Apolitical's 100 most influential people in gender policy in 2021. At TRI, we are privileged to have her as one of our closest mentors. And thank you, ma'am, for providing your critical guidance in setting up the Unit on Inclusion and Equality. We also have with us Gagan Sethi. Gagan has worked for over 30 years advocating for minority rights in diverse cultural settings across Asia. He has mentored many development organizations on building lasting institutions that foster gender justice. His thoughts on the role of men and masculinities in gender justice has given us a fresh lens in building an equitable future. We are also privileged to have with us Soledad artist Prillaman. Soledad has dedicated the last decade on research that aims to gain a deeper understanding of how and when the voices of women are represented in politics and policy, particularly in the most remote villages of Madhya Pradesh. Her forthcoming book titled The Patriarchal Political Order, The Making and Unraveling of the Gendered Political Participation Gap in India, that explains why women in rural India participate less in politics and identifies the mechanisms through which the prevailing gender gap in political participation can be reduced. Last but not the least, it's my pleasure to introduce my new colleague, Seema Bhaskaran. She has had a long career working with the government on gender and social inclusion. She has previously worked with the National Rural Livelihoods Mission, Ministry of Human Resource Development, and has been associated with National Institute of Rural Development and Panchayati Raj and Kerala Institute of Local Administration. I'm looking forward to working with her and learning from her as she leads TRI's Unit on Inclusion and Equality. I'll not take any more time. I'm excited to hear and learn from the wisdoms and insights from this brilliant panel. But before we begin, a few housekeeping rules. For those who have joined us offline, we have kept index cards in each of the tables. Please write down your thoughts, suggestions, and questions on these cards, and periodically I'll be collecting the cards and giving it to Suneeta. For those who have joined online, we have the Q&A section on our Zoom window. So please utilize that for your question and answers. Thank you. And over to you, Suneeta.
Thank you very much. And hello to everybody in this room, many friends, many co-travelers, and to Soledad, particularly from the other end of the world and early in the morning her time, and to my co-panelists. And thank you, TRI. We were actually going to break the rule. We were going to have a male moderator. So not for me to get into the gender stereotypical role of women taking the agenda forward, but for some emergencies that he faced, I have stepped in. So do remember that the original intention was to change the ways that men can lead on gender equality as well. Now, for today's session, essentially, I have planned, it's a conversation really. I just wanted to make some opening remarks. I have also followed some bits of your work, and particularly some of your sessions this morning and through the week. And I wanted to highlight a few things in the context of what we're going to talk about today, the gender justice in present times. Now, while we're looking at the impact of inequalities in the lives of rural women across their diversity, I cannot help but ask, is this journey towards empowerment that is going on scale by many, many actors, including the government, what is the cost that women pay in terms of their increasing unpaid care work while they don't really get out of structural poverty and inequalities? They still have limited access to assets and resources. Of course, change is coming up. Of course, land rights and housing rights and other rights are being promoted. They live in constant fear of violence and lack of safety at home, in the public space and workspace. And yes, we are doing a lot to end violence against women and girls and other gender identities. And every day they continue to navigate the patriarchal social norms that adversely affect their mobility, their choices, and their voice. So while progress is being made, there's also a cost they are paying. And I think it's important not only to talk about their achievements, which we should, but also to realize what it takes to bring about this empowerment and to turn inequality into that of more equality, so to speak. Now, when I look at the statistics, McKinsey has done a study, and many of you know the statistics, that women do 75% of the world's total unpaid care work. I wish this was a study and I could have said it's a women's group study. We used to do this study, and we did say this 20 years ago, but no one took us seriously. McKinsey does the study. We take it seriously. Globally, women and girls have put in 3.26 billion hours of unpaid care work a day. This work is invisible, undervalued, and unaccounted for. And it's not just women and girls, there are a lot of men and boys too, and those that gender diverse people too, who put in a lot of work. But the point is that this is not counted in our economic framework. And ILO says that these services were to be economically valued. They would amount to 9% of the global GDP. So let's look at really hardcore evidence and see what is happening. In 2019, the NSS study report, done after 20 years in India, said that women spend 299 minutes a day on unpaid domestic services, and these are largely rural women, while men spend 97 minutes. Now, I'm not getting into essentialism because that's not important, but the point is that how does work get structured? And if we all do not restructure the work and wages and assets, then equality is a far-off dream. The NFHS 5 data, which we are all working on, you are working on it as well, indicates an increase in gender-based violence in many states. In fact, married women between 18 to 49 years have been a victim of spousal violence in 5 states. And these are states that you and I work in. Almost 1 in 3 women experience some sort of physical or sexual violence from their partners and spouses. So the home that we take for granted, the home that we all lived in and worked from during the COVID times, was the site of violence. We didn't have to go out. We didn't have to talk about stranger violence and other forms of violence. We were looking at the home as a site of discrimination and violence on an everyday basis. Now, there are many such statistics, and you have them all. The question is, what will it take for us to transform them meaningfully? Was it not just 3 days ago, you and I have read the news headline, and I know that you're thinking about it too, in one of the states and some of the districts of that state, elected women stand aside. Husbands take oath on the Constitution in their names. Soledad, this is something I'd like you to pick up when you speak to it. Such a public displacement of elected women representatives by their male relatives. It's constantly happening, whether it's the Sarpanchpati or the Panchpati. In every of our trainings, we have talked about it. Who is de facto taking the power? And this is constitutional power. So the question about, are we all also living with assumptions that rural women cannot become meaningful, powerful, elected leaders? We need to look at the norms. We need to shift the terrains of power in our society. We need to shift the paradigm, so to speak. And each of us has to walk the talk. I think no longer any of us in this room or anywhere else wants to wait another 135 years for gender equality to come. That's what the World Economic Forum report says. Why are we waiting for so long? Why can't we do it now? I must also mention that at the International Women's Day campaign that was centered around the theme, Break the Bias, earlier this year, it was devoted to celebrating the achievements of diverse women. And I know that there are many, many case examples of the journeys that they have traversed, about the change they have made, the joys that they go through, but also a lot of pain that they have been through, especially during the COVID times. The campaign, while working for gender equality, urged people to call out gender stereotyping, violence, discrimination when they see it, and to no longer remain silent. We need to create such a world for diverse people with intersectional values, for trans persons, for gender fluid identities, women with disabilities, etc., etc. And while women will walk their own individual and collective paths, and all the groups and institutions that many of us around this room are working on in the sphere of economic participation, or for equal representation, or be at the table for policy making, we need to amplify their ask of us, nothing for us without us. And I wish we had more rural women in this room, on the panel. I know that language is a barrier. I know that a lot of work is being done for them, but it's important that we do it together, that we walk this talk together. We have very knowledgeable panelists and audience as well. And I'm going to take the first round of questions. And to you, Soledad, you have done a lot of important work on rural women's participation, political participation, particularly among tribal women in Madhya Pradesh and other regions. Can you speak a little bit about their journeys, their paths, their barriers? Thank you. Over to you.
Thank you, Suneeta, and thank you for what a wonderful introduction to this session. I hope to raise some of the same points as I speak about the particularities of political empowerment for women. I want to start by saying it's really wonderful to be on a panel discussing such an important topic with these incredible panelists. I wish I could be there in person to join all of you and participate in what I know has been a week of invigorating discussions. And I'd like to take a little bit of time. I'm going to try and be a bit brief, but we'll see how I do. And speak about the work and the research that I have done with women in India. But I want to acknowledge that not just given the struggles of the past few years, but my position being based right now in the US, that I've only recently been able to travel to India in the last few years. And so I'm going to speak instead to broader trends and really defer to panelists and all of you and your wisdom about the on-the-ground realities today, and speak largely from the work that I've done in Madhya Pradesh with tribal communities, though some of this work that I'll reference is also based in Bihar and Orissa as well. Okay, so the work that I have done focuses specifically on the political lives of women in rural India. And often when we think about political empowerment, we go straight to thinking about electoral representation and getting women into office. But instead, what I have focused on is all of the ways that women inhabitants interact with the state, whether that's to claim entitlements, to make larger demands for their interests and for gender justice, and also to seek representation, both electoral and in all manner of public spaces. And so I thought I would speak a little bit about the historical challenges to women's political empowerment, how some of those challenges we've made traction on, that women have made traction on, but then what the remaining barriers have been and continue to be. And so the historical challenges that women have faced are clear in the data. Women have long lagged in their access to the state vis-a-vis men. Statistics about women's representation in public office, electoral representation, I think are well known, but I wanted to add a few things that I think speak to Suneeta's point about representation through Pati Sarpanch and other forms of proxyism as well. So one of the things that I have done while away from India is collect a lot of data on local elections. And one of the things I found that's really striking is comparing across 10 states. What we see is that in non-reserved seats, between 2 and 10% of those seats are won by women. And this has not changed in the last 10 years, in the last decade. And so I think this speaks to Suneeta's point of the little authority and agency for even those women who are elected into office, but the barriers that exist once we move past legal protections, these barriers to just presence in political spaces. And these challenges of presence apply to everyday female inhabitants as well. My own surveys in Madhya Pradesh, Orissa, Bihar, as well as survey data from across India, reveal that women engage in politics on a day-to-day basis outside of things like voting, things like filing claims on the state or participating in Gram Sabha at about 1/4 the rate of men. And importantly, these inequalities appear as stark for women of all caste and tribe backgrounds. This is something that cuts across many of the diverse identities that women hold. And as I'm sure will surprise no one here, the data show that these trends are not for lack of interest or desire. Most women articulate a strong demand to participate in politics, but many suggest that participation is a household decision, and so they lack complete agency over their participation. For example, less than 50% of nearly 10,000 women that we surveyed in MP said that they could exert complete agency over their vote choice, meaning that if their very best friend were running for office, they would not vote for her if it was against the family's interests. And this holds as well when thinking about when women articulate why they aren't participating in politics more. Again, more than 50% of them didn't say that it was because they didn't want to, or even that they didn't have time, acknowledging that these things are costly given the unpaid care work that women do. But instead, they articulated that the main reason they did not participate in politics was that someone from their household was already going to be in those spaces. And so what we've seen historically is this challenge of presence, that women don't even have access to political spaces and institutions at all levels. Yet on this, I think we've started to see progress being made. Reservations, for example, have been the sort of key political policy to try and increase women's presence in local political institutions. We can discuss the efficacy of this institution further. But we've also seen progress even absent legal protections. For example, the last national election in India was remarked to have the highest turnout of women in history, in most parts of the country, more women turning out than men. And my own work with SHGs in MP has found that women's political participation has increased substantially, doubling for women who were members of SHGs and quadrupling for SHG women who participated in explicit gender justice initiatives, for which I know Suneeta's work was critical. And in these instances, the gender gap in presence for everyday women had all but disappeared. More broadly, we're seeing more and more instances of collective action amongst women, both at the micro and the macro level, to demand greater presence in political spaces. And so one thing that is important to acknowledge is that many of these gains happened despite and often because of continued economic hardship and challenges to livelihoods. And I raise this because the common model of women's empowerment is that first economic empowerment must be achieved before social change and political empowerment are possible. And while I am not contesting that path or model, I think this evidence suggests another model is equally possible, that even without fundamental shifts in economic position, women can become politically empowered and demand political representation. And we're starting now to see how this can have important consequences for their economic livelihoods as they gain access to entitlements and programs they had not previously received. And so while I don't want to suggest that things were perfect here, we've seen incredible growth in the presence of rural women in politics. But I wanted to just highlight what I see as the key barrier moving forward, and then I'll turn it over to the other panelists. My ongoing work seeks to understand the barriers to voice, women's ability to make their own interests and demands, even when they have presence in these spaces. And so for this, I just wanted to raise a few statistics to stimulate conversation, and then I'll conclude. So in a recent survey that I did with a few co-authors that may be in the audience, every adult resident, what we did was we surveyed every adult resident in 6 villages in MP so that we could understand the entire village ecosystem. And what we asked was, who do you discuss politics with? Now, we saw that men on average discuss politics with roughly 3.5 other people, and women with less than 2. So we already see a gender gap emerging. But I think even more telling is that of the people men said they discussed politics with, women comprised only 4%. Women, on the other hand, said that men comprised 60% of those with whom they discussed politics. And this has many implications, but key is that this suggests that women and the discussions that they have with men do not even register as political in the eyes of most men. So another statistic to share from the same survey is that these gender inequalities become even more stark when we measure whom within a village has influence or is seen to have influence. Men report influencing 5 times more people than women, and they have nearly 3 times more access to those that they articulate as having influence in the communities, even those women who are identified as having influence. And qualitative interviews with women in the same communities show that even the most politically active women continue to struggle to have their voices heard by those with legitimate authority granted by the state, often experiencing substantial pushback to demands that challenge prevailing authority structures and norms. And this is where I think some of the points that Suneeta raised are really important. Violence, co-optation, and backlash are many of the mechanisms that await women when they demand representation in political spaces. And so I want to just conclude my initial thoughts by suggesting 3 questions that I'd love to engage discussion, or that I see as important in this space. The first, which is, where should women's political lives fit in our models of social change and gender justice as a consequence or as a driver? The second is presence enough to ensure gender justice in political domains, or must voice be protected and ensured as well? And third, what is the cost that women bear in demanding representation if they are not received or seen as political agents? And so really looking forward to having a discussion.
Thank you. The fact that you've talked about another pathway being possible and not looking at it linearly from economic participation to social participation, I think is a very important finding. And also the perception of whether women can be effective political leaders as they see themselves and as others see them. So thank you, Soledad, for your study, your analysis, and your questions. And I would like to take it forward now to Gagan, and I'll come back to you in the second round, Soledad. What is the transition that you're seeing rural women go through in this journey of empowerment? And how do you see the patriarchal norms transforming themselves? Soledad talked about backlash on women, the violence that they face. So what does it do in terms of women's control over their autonomy, freedoms, voice, and choice? Over to you.
Yeah, thank you, Suneeta, and good to be with people whom I worked with, and some of them co-travelers. Rather than give you my understanding, I can maybe talk of my insights through some of my anecdotes. I remember my first young 1977 when I started work, and I was doing a lot of these mitti pani work of cooperatives, social forestry projects, and I was looking at the social side, and I would go and work with, in Gujarat I'm talking of, and we would work with men and women, and of course there were separate spaces, and one would have to go to men separately, women separately, discussing things. And one of the things was that we were used to be putting an agriculture officer to look at the work there. And I had just gone and introduced somebody there and and he would stay in the village like we used to do that. And I went back after a day or two and came back the next week. And I, sensed something, that there was something amiss, especially the way women would greet me otherwise and the way this time they were greeting me. And I said, what's happening? So they said, of course, this discussion was Gujarati. He said, come in and we want to talk to you. I said, what happened? Say. He said, no, come in. So, okay. And we went into a room huddled up with about 8 or 9 of them. And they said, you have a relationship with us for years, but this guy whom you have put, and they used a very Gujarati word, say, any aankh barabar nathi, which says, uski aankh theek nahi hai. He doesn't have. Now it's a metaphor. And I got it that what there's, he hadn't done anything overt by which I could hang him or call him this thing, but they communicated a protest through this simple line saying, any aankh barabar nathi. And I remember getting livid, and we at that time in motorcycle, put him back on my motorcycle, brought him to Ahmedabad and said, first resign. And my senior saying, but you can't do that. I said, no, I don't care. Let him first resign. And then I'll tell you what happened. That was anger. But that's not the point. The point is, women have a way to protest which men don't understand. And I think we are not giving that space for them to protest the way they want to protest. We want them to protest the way men want to protest. And that was my first learning. I'll fast track to 87 in the same area where some of my friends were killed by the upper caste. It was a very, that time, famous incident, and Suneeta, you were around at that time in Gujarat. Of course, it was the Dalits versus the upper caste, and for the first time we took a judicial battle. Normally these things were settled. Even murders were settled. But I think as time went on, the idea of justice started coming into play, and justice from the court's point of view. And I remember fighting that legal battle. And we had about 70 witnesses, as our own special public prosecutor, the same prosecutor who later on helped us with the Bilkis Bag, a young man at that time. And out of 65 of those witnesses, there were, I think, 42 men, and the rest were women. And of course, judicial battles are different. This has nothing to do with facts. It has to do with what's written in the documents. But out of those 42 men, all of them from the community, 99%, were forced to turn hostile. They were either paid, they were either threatened, The same happened to the women. But out of the balanced women, it was 8 of them who one by one moved out into the thing, pulled people out and said, they were the ones who killed. The first time we got a conviction, and it was because women exercised power because they fought fear in their heads. And that's when I resigned from my job and I said, I think for 10 years, I was doing all the wrong things by spending more time with women and men and agriculture and cooperatives when I should have been working with the power of women and how can they exercise power. And that's when my engagement with Mahila Samakhya started. And I'm, in a sense, connecting this to the transition time. And of course, the Mahila Samakhya experiment was an amazing experiment, and many of you were there, where women as collectives, young women, and most of them were young women, who, when they went through the process of transformation and seeing, could fight fear and had the courage to stand up to justice. And I think a lot of processes in the country started, especially the use of law and women using law to access justice. I think that was the next space. I'll further now fast track to almost 2002 and beyond. And my life work was largely with Muslim women and men. And one of the largest things I realized at that time is that unless you give this women space to talk and to own houses, and my negotiations with, at that time, the Muslim organizations, because rest of all the INGOs, NGOs and all ran away out of fear. They were there for the earthquake, crores. But when it came to riots and rehabilitation, they ran away. Fear because of the politics of it. But I think the only negotiation I did with the women, with the Muslim men's organization was that all houses to be built would be in both names. And it was an interesting process to see how they were scared to put women's name in the houses. Therefore, the whole issue of ownership, I think, was very critical at that time. But I think, again, when you push your power to reorganize power, things change. But I want to mention 2 more things and I'll stop, Suneeta. It was after that that one saw, and I'll go to, maybe you made me talk of rural women, but I'll talk a little of urban spaces because that's again a new space for me to work. You know, a city like Ahmedabad was cleaned up in terms of division. All public spaces, gardens, parks, this thing, were cleaned and no Mussalman man or women would dare to occupy that space. But increasingly, Muslim women, when they had this handle to say, you men, you couldn't protect us. And when I had a deeper conversation, now we will lead. And come to Ahmedabad today and go to each of those public, very fancy parks. In the morning and the evening, you will see burqa-clad women doing their morning walks, fully in putting their identity out there and challenging patriarchy and religious fundamentalism openly and saying, take me on. That's what I see, a shift. People will say, "Bahut kharab ho raha." I know I can speak dozens on that. But I see this amazing change when women take power and then actually capture spaces. And the last space which I see so clearly, which changes the internal, we started an Azad Foundation does a very interesting program on training women taxi drivers in Delhi and in some of the other cities. So I was engaging with them and said, "Why don't you come and help us do this in Ahmedabad?" And they gave us the initial support. And it's now about 3.5, 4 years. And we have, I think, about 250 women trained drivers, of which 150 of them are Muslims. And the rest, mostly the young women, fully this thing with their mobiles, with their technologies. And I say, "What's your purpose? Why are you doing this?" She says, "We want to capture the city. We want to capture the city with our presence. These roads are ours too. These spaces are ours too." I think it was very interesting. And I said, "But what do you see in the future?" And they say, "We want to see that day a legislation where all school buses are drivered by women. Because we see what happens in school buses driven by men." Now look at the level of sensibilities that they are going and building their own vision in spaces and capturing new spaces. I think if you allow that, and the renegotiation, therefore, they have to do at home. But once they have that power from outside, they renegotiate. They get beaten once, twice, but then because they take the economic space also, they start controlling the social space. I think it's a very interesting journey I've been seeing of empowerment. I'm just giving you snippets of my experience, but therefore makes me very deeply committed that if we don't look at the politics of this and just transactionalize the whole idea of women's participation, tokenize it, I think we will be going at great injustice.
That's wonderful. I mean, you have so many quotable quotes out here. Power to transform power. I think we do that in our trainings, right? But what I think I've heard from you is also the fact of how the notions of gender justice are being challenged, right? Just 2 days ago, or was it yesterday, I think Justice Chandrachud also said something about the legal framework does not necessarily, I'm not paraphrasing him because I don't have it in writing, does not necessarily result in justice. And not all justice needs a legal framework. So I think we have to understand that notions of justice also have other roots. And we have in our learning processes even looked at notions of feminist justice and recovery and what does it mean for each one of us or a collective of us. And also what you're talking about is a right to a city, a right to a space, a right to occupy a space because it has been denied to you due to social norms. So it's also the transformation of structures, the presence, the politics of presence in public spaces, the politics of organizing as collectives around your unique identities, a minority identity, as in the case of Muslim women, and also the journeys that you don't have to allow people to do things. Women and those that are exploited and marginalized will do things. We're just facilitators of that change, and it takes decades of work to do that. And in light of that, I will now move on to you, Seema. You have done some profound work. In the morning, we did hear the secretary, joint secretary, speak on the NRLM experience. Tell us a little bit about how have you integrated gender, you and the team that has worked on it, integrated gender equality into the NRLM programming for rural women, and what were some of the challenges you have faced therein? Thank you.
Thank you for this opportunity to speak and share experiences. So, like in 2016, we began to realize that despite having formed all the institutions like SHGs, VOs, CLFs, because we had this approach of the resource blocks and the intensive blocks, we began to realize that decision making at the home wasn't happening. And we also realized that asset creation, even with advanced states like Andhra Pradesh or Telangana or Kerala, which are harbingers in the moment, asset creation in the names of women. Of course, NFHS 5 also shows similar kind of statistics that asset creation in the names of women is still not happening. We also saw that when it comes to mobility and also articulation within the institutions, interface with public institutions at the village level and the block level, that was happening. But when it comes to the household, still we couldn't see that there was decision making from the women. And also because the SHG movement began on the basis of the non-negotiables of microcredit, there was exclusion which was happening in most of the villages. Like extremely poor or vulnerable communities could not be part of the SHG movement. So this made us realize that we really need to have gender operational strategies inbuilt into the program. And we had two approaches for integration. One was, of course, to develop gender operational strategies, which was specific to the SRLMs, which could be very different in different states because the issues which were coming up were very different. Also to have a sensitization of the staff across the SRLMs, because we know that this is a livelihood program and most of the people are focusing on livelihood, so may not understand, though we were working with women, would not understand the gender nuances or the gender dimensions or manifestations. So it was very important, to sensitize staff across states. So one of the tasks, which was one of the approaches, was to sensitize the staff across states at all levels of the mission, beginning from the state, district to the block. And then also developing institutional mechanisms based, and taking up issues which were relevant to the cluster level federations. So developing institutional mechanisms was like having a gender point person at the SHG level, having a SAC, Social Action Committee at the village organization level, having a SAC at the CLF level, also having gender forums at various levels where you could actually have conversations with, or you could work, there could be concerted efforts with all the frontline workers, like the panchayats, elected representatives, or the ASHA, ANM, the police beat, the school at the village level, that is at the panchayat level, and block level, to have gender forums at the block level. So this has been the effort across 28 states. And we saw that though we felt that a graduation approach or taking up practical gender needs in the gender operational strategies could be initiated, we saw that states were approaching it in very different manner. Like they would be taking up both practical and strategic gender needs. So state like Jharkhand right away in the beginning said that they want to work on violence against women. They also took up witch hunting. Whereas Chhattisgarh said that they would like to work on malnourishment. So that was a part of the gender operational strategy, where they felt there was a lot of gender discrimination, even in terms of access to food and nutrition, and a lot of gendering in terms of, how the adolescents are deprived of food. And so these things started reflecting in the Chhattisgarh operational strategy. So it varied from state to state. Apart from that, the second approach, so we felt that it wasn't sufficient to work on gender as a standalone. So this went on to the last point of where we thought we should have gender resource center, not only institutional mechanisms up to the level of the CLF, but we need to have gender resource center at the level of the block, which would be the highest order institution to deal with issues of rights and entitlements, as well as grievances and a violation of rights. So we started having special projects. One of the special projects was in Kerala, where we set up 140 gender justice centers in panchayats, being very well established. As you know, that Kerala local self-government is already very established, and one could have gender resource centers, where we also not only talked about violation of rights, but we also talked about gender planning and budgeting, because we have WCP or Women's Component Plan well structured in a state like Kerala. So this was one of the approaches. And the other approach, we realized that we need to work with all other verticals. So we started actually, we didn't know how to take it forward, because we know that integration has to happen across verticals. So we thought the best way to go about it was vetting all the curriculum, like looking at all the modules of financial inclusion, livelihoods, farm livelihoods, non-farm livelihoods, looking at, curriculum of IBCB, and trying to vet. So we, try to vet with the help of lot of partners and subcommittees and all of them. Like we vetted around 100 modules, and then also went into the advisories of all the verticals. And actually we came up with recommendations on the basis of which SOPs are being developed. In addition to this, we felt that, we started training on integration across SRLMs. Of course, the staff were reluctant in the beginning, but then slowly they began to understand that it's very important to integrate gender into livelihoods or any economic empowerment processes that they undertake. And finally, we thought that we need to also develop special projects to see that, we can have models for inclusion. So like we have had, special projects for PVTG communities in Kerala to begin with, which was supposed to be developed as an immersion site, and which began on a different way. Instead of beginning on microcredit, we started work on social development and livelihoods with the PVTG communities, because we realized that they could not, work on Panchasutra model or microcredit model. So we started working on livelihoods and, social development like food and nutrition, education of children, and then move on to institution building and capacity building. This was later upscaled in Jharkhand and, Chhattisgarh. So I just wanted to say that we also looked at intersectionality, because we believe that gender integration means inclusion also, where you have to perhaps relax the norms of non-negotiable norms on which all the SDGs and its federations are built up. Apart from that, we also had some projects like Garima project, which is on witch hunting, which is prevention of, women being branded as survivor, as witch, branded as witches and then beaten up. There are issues of land related to it. There is also issues of, sexual violence related to it. So there is a special project on that, and also on migration. So we had special projects supported by the World Bank on migrants during the COVID time. So I just wanted to tell you that how we, worked on inclusion as well as gender, in a very integrated manner. So these are some of the experiences that we had as part of NRLM. Thank you.
Thank you, Seema. That has really been, the NRLM program has really been one of the best practices, and it has effectively built on the learnings of the last many decades, including Mahila Samakhya, Kudumbashree, and other such work. And I think we're looking forward to it being a movement that really makes transformative change. I'm going to come to you, Soledad. I'm afraid I can't do 3 rounds. We just have another half an hour or so, and we have to go into Q&A. But Soledad, you were at the Stanford King Center on Global Development, and I want to know how you think you are going to be using your work there and the partnerships you have created in India to address some of the questions you raised about women's political participation, their presence, the backlash that they face. If you could share a little bit and how such partnerships can be deepened and how the evidence can be used for policy making further. Thank you.
Thanks, Suneeta. And thanks to the wonderful other panelist discussion. I'm reeling with thoughts. So I'll speak just very briefly to this. As Suneeta mentioned, I'm based at Stanford. I work with the King Center, and I'm also starting a new research lab on exactly these kinds of issues, how to build inclusive democracy and development practices. And it speaks to a broader question that I'm sure this audience has lots of thoughts on and would love to continue dialogues, which is how best to integrate research and academic partnerships with both practice on the ground, but also I think a conversation that is sort of lurking in the background, and Suneeta acknowledged in the beginning, which is also with women themselves and how to integrate across the entire ecosystem of what we're all working towards. And so I will speak a little bit to the academic side of all of this, our plans and where I could see some scope for improvement, but I also will acknowledge some of the challenges in this. And so as part of this lab and center, I see, as you've probably gotten the sense of, I really like data and evidence, both quantitative and qualitative. And that's also the what I see as the strong suit that an academic training has enabled, as opposed to much of the depth of wisdom from on the ground experience, though we try to make sure that it's not without some understanding of what reality can look like. And so some of what we've been doing, particularly given how COVID has constrained the ability to learn and do research in safe ways, is to build data systems and data processes. And so I mentioned one, which was to try and collate a database on local elections so that we can start to fill the gaps on questions around agency and proxyism, getting measures to quantify how frequent a practice this is, understanding representation outside of reservations, and a question that I saw in the Q&A, thinking about things like intersectionalities, for which you need large databases to really understand the scope and breadth, given the diversity, not just across women, but across all of India, and how those things intersect. And so thinking about using this space, one, as to build data systems, some of which we're doing using data that's already available through government systems, but the other of which I raised to this audience, and something that I know TRIF is working really hard to do, which is thinking about how organizations can build data systems that then can exponentiate learning. And then the other of which is using that to generate questions that matter for those working on the ground and for women themselves, like emerging from those communities in ways that we can create cross institution and cross space collaborations that integrate each of these different comparative advantages and skill sets to build a wider body of evidence. I guess I should have mentioned at the beginning of my answer to this, but call out that what I see is not one of the biggest, but an important constraint to gender justice is a lack of data and a lack of good data, a lack of knowing. And, for example, in the domain of political participation, part of why I've had to do data collection is measures outside of voter turnout are almost non-existent in cross-country studies. And so we lack the ability to say this is what attendance at Gram Sabha looks like in every state in India and every corner of India. And without this knowing, it's hard to really address many of the important questions on all of our minds, both around what are the remaining barriers, but also how do these barriers vary across the numerous identities that women inhabit. And so all of that to say as an imperfect answer, but I would love to sort of posit and identify jointly a model in which academics, practitioners, and women themselves can work together to fill these knowledge gaps in a way which I think has been the historic challenge that actually is useful and responsive to the needs on the ground. And so while there's not a perfect answer, I think those are some of the things that we're working towards.
No, it's very interesting because I think what you're talking about is the work that's being done globally and nationally on the SDG data portals that have got created, data sets that have got created, and also women in control of the data. It's their data. They're no longer objects of the data, but they're subjects of the data, using it to transform their own lives. Moving this forward, I mean, Gagan, how do you see the kind of transitions you talked about, very systemic, very fundamental shifts in values, norms, practices, inequalities. How do you see civil society playing an important role moving forward and knowing the challenges that we face collectively as civil society in our pathways to gender justice?
But Suneeta, I'm going today evening for a 2-day colloquium in just that, to Bombay. And therefore it's a subject of my attention the last few years. And my fundamental issue is, what is this identity shift we have had from being a civil society to an NGO? And I think this shift in the last 20 years has pushed us in a highly transactional mode. I think we were supposed to be a civil society in tension, in creative tension with the state and market. However, market has even controlled the state today because it sets the standards of what the state should be doing, and it started to control what civil society is to be doing. Having said that, I think we have to reimagine, and my only thing to my very, very close friends and organizations I work is, ask this question: who are you first? What is your first identity? Is it what you do is your identity? Or is it the values and principles of civil society which are rooted in the fact that your job, it is because civil society is there, there's democracy. And I think we spend 99% of our time in building the identity of what we do. And therefore our networks are all around livelihood or around violence. Fine, I'm okay with that. But at least 30% of our time are we investing in our core business, which is we are civil society. And I don't care whether a civil society is for profit, not profit. It's not about NGOs. And I think to look at that is, therefore, what is our relationship with movement building? Are we investing in movement building? And I use the word movement, it's investing in leadership. It's investing in cascading leadership of people's organization, because that's what deepens democracy. And that's what our core business is. Economic freedom is not by itself going in the kind of inequality gaps that you can do as much as you like. We are further and further polarizing this nation. And I think there's no way you can compete with the inequality that is happening. And therefore, what are we thinking? थोड़ा उनसे बस खाना पीना रह जाएगा. ये सब बहाने थे. These were all just excuses to build movements. How have they become the core purpose is my question I'm asking. So my plea always is, the techno-managerial approach is needed, accountability is needed, but are we empowering and building leadership where people, and especially women, are getting the spaces to deepen democracy? And if we can't invest in that, then let us stop being what I would say, stop taking tax benefits. We are using public money. And that's why we are civil society.
That's a point for reflection. If we will have to really move to gender justice and equality across all our lives and various institutions, then certainly we're accountable and it is public money. And I also want to say at the same time, women also tell us, you can't give me rights. No one can give anyone rights. Rights have to be claimed. And it is in that business of transforming leadership and building people's competencies, giving them opportunities, knowledge, information, skills, they will claim their rights. We're not claiming it for them. In a democracy, that's the way governance takes place. And I think we have to remember that again and again. And what I would do is I would weave in a question to you, Seema. Some questions have come from the floor, and ask you to respond to that in the way that in the context of NRLM, how do you address these questions? Because it says that the root of gender injustice begins at the birth of the girl child, right? And we do know we have in some parts still a sex ratio divide that is, we're very concerned about. Now, what could be some of the future strategies that are needed to eliminate discrimination within all the institutions from the home to the school, at the adolescent age to adult age? And where is that space? And what about, gender identities like the LGBTQI, those that do not belong to the binary, that live outside and are marginalized and excluded in policy making? How does NRLM, address some of these questions, and what kind of partnerships have you built in the process? Thank you.
Yeah, so for the first question, of course, NRLM's major thrust has been on capacity building. So I just told you about one of the approaches was sensitization of staff across all the levels of the mission. And this was done in a manner which was extremely participatory with scope for personal reflection. Because if we just talk about integration in various verticals, people may take it only as a professional, kind of change that they have to go through. So it's always these sessions have given scope for personal reflection on one's own home and, the culture within the home and how the home can be engendered, and then also practicing it at the professional level. Second part of it is like focus has been on cadre trainings. As you know, that cadres are catalysts in NRLM. So there has been a lot of focus on training the cadres, looking at the socialization aspects and social construct, and trying to, I've seen this very well in even small, in Gwara Nivas block of MP, where we had this program, and where I saw that cadres were intervening in a lot of issues. They were actually talking about the social construct and socialization processes, which they have tried to change within the families. So there are things which are happening at the level of by the cadres at the level of the institutions, and though it's very difficult, also at the household, trickling down to the household level. So training of the cadres and training of the institutional mechanisms has been one of the strategies. As far as inclusion of LGBTQs, actually we have only been very minimally successful in this aspect. We started working on inclusion of single women, inclusion of elderly and PWD, and inclusion of transgender. Now this, there is a commitment from all the states to work on inclusion of the transgender, but the states which have successfully taken it forward have been Kerala and Tamil Nadu and Puducherry, and other states are trying to take it forward, though there is not much clarity on the strategies of inclusion, because most of them keep moving the transgender community. But presently there is at least a space has been opened up for articulation and discussion. So there is a space opened up within NRLM to include not only as part of the SHG, but also as individuals, if not part of SHGs, and to work with most vulnerable and deprived communities.
Wonderful. Thank you, because I think this is all very doable. Gender equality is doable. It has to be done by everybody. Nobody else is going to walk the path for you. So it's not an agenda in the project, and it's not to do with your timelines and results framework. It is to do with transforming your mindset, your attitudes, behaviors, for each one of us, and whoever we are, wherever we are located. Soledad, I'm just going to come to you because I think you have also received the question that has come up. This is regarding your study, and we want to know whether your study has brought out specific insights into the intersections of caste, class, religion with gender and political participation. I think you did refer to some of the intersectional issues when you shared your data. What does it say about empowerment? So if you want to throw a little more light on your study and your work. Thank you.
Yes, thank you for this question. And I'm happy to speak to this and acknowledge that this is a domain in which I think a lot more evidence is needed, or at least on my front is needed to bear. But a few things I can say on how intersectional and the diverse identities that women inhabit shape their political lives. So with respect to political participation, drawing on data from across India, from the Indian Human Development Survey, what we see is that there are important intersectional identities and that there are important differences across intersectional identities, largely, for example, caste. And from my own data, what we see is that women from scheduled castes have much lower, about half the political participation and political agency of women from upper caste OBC women, as well as scheduled tribes, women from scheduled tribes. And so the constraints are much higher. One thing to note, though, is that we see a gender gap within these different groups that looks about the same. And so these intersectional differences, these caste-based, these other identity-based differences exist similarly within women as it does within men, meaning that the difference across genders swamp the differences across castes. That's not to diminish those differences. It's simply to acknowledge that that there are a lot of shared barriers in addition to additional barriers that some women face. The other thing I wanted to say is that I mentioned the survey where we censused all individuals within communities. Now, mind you, this is 6 villages, and so the amount of variation that we're capturing across India is, infinitesimal. But one thing that I think was quite striking is that when asked with whom do you discuss politics, women more so than men said that they engage and discuss politics only with those from their caste or tribe. So 90% of women said that they only discuss politics with women from their caste or tribe, whereas about 75% of men say the same. And similarly, I think it's important to acknowledge that, again, I'm thinking and speaking specifically to caste, but who gets influence varies substantially here. I've also mentioned data on which women win in unreserved seats. And if you look at the caste background or the social category background of those who win in unreserved seats, like 95% of women winning in those seats are from upper castes and general castes. And so there are important variations in influence. Now, what I want to just conclude on, I don't have a lot to say about language or religion, just given the localities and geographies that I have studied. I think that's a domain in which I need to learn more. But the starkest difference that might be of no surprise came with respect to age and your position in the life cycle, both for women and for men. Women under the age of 40, I mentioned that less than 50% of women on average had agency over their vote choice. It's less than 75% of women under the age of 40. And so age and where you are in the life cycle seems to be a really defining characteristic, unsurprising given what we know, given what patriarchy is. But that these identities are important in thinking about how we move forward with policy and practice.
Wonderful. It's reminding me about the fact that there are privileges in the inclusion approach that we adopt, and there are exclusions within the inclusion approach that we adopt. And we need to really re-examine who is being structurally excluded in the system. Maybe very quickly, Gagan, if you can talk a little bit. I know I have a question. There are questions on SDGs, which I'm sure we need another panel for. It's a big question, but I will just bring in the whole issue of the fact that everyone talks about working with men, toxic masculinities, young men transforming their minds. What do you have to say about that? Why only work with women to change society? Why not with men?
Oh, of course. I mean, I think men have to understand the extent of dehumanization that they have gone through because they experience so much of privilege. disconnected with life itself. And I think this process, and I've worked with Pradhan now for almost 5 years on this, and it's been a very interesting TRI. Been very interesting. I think two spaces very important. I always say, in all institutions, women must have a caucus, which is a political space. And in a sense, I want to connect it with that. I think political space in organizations held by women where inequality is so huge is important. But men becoming human is a process also which is very important. I think men are missing out on life and enjoying life. And I think whenever we have worked with men in the whole issue of gender, and give them the space to cry, give them the space to get in touch with their sensations. I think that's a very important space to this thing. I think that's only when together we humanize the world. The more privilege you have, the more empty you are. Because you're totally disconnected with life. That's the experience I've had. And I think women can really help you connect with life if only you have the humility to do so. I'll stop here, but
Sound very Zen-like right now. We're getting very philosophical. Perhaps a session on gender and philosophies, right, is due as well. There's a question on SDGs, and all I'd like to say to Mausami is that really, gender equality, the SDG 5 agenda is there. It's the first time we didn't have it in the MDG framework. But gender equality, women's rights, rights of LGBTQ, discrimination run through all the SDGs. So when you're talking about how to connect SDG 5 to SDG 7 to SDG 8, there's a lot that can be done in the ecosystem. There's a lot that is happening, but much, much more needs to be done to even comprehend what the SDGs are about and what the data is telling us. Niti Aayog does bring out its report every year, and you should look at, what is it called, the flashboard or whatever, the dashboard, sorry, the dashboard that tells us about the gains and progress made and where the challenges are. I'm afraid I do have to close. And Seema, is there anything you would like to say? We can move on. I just want to close this session being very grateful for some of the questions, the experiences, the insights, the journeys that our panelists have had. And I do want to recite a few lines from Kamla Basin, who's been my mentor and long duration friend, who in a workshop, it was collectively penned with women from rural and tribal areas were together when these words were penned, which really meant in collectivity, we shall be stronger. Tumhara saath milne se ehsaas-e quwwat aaya hai. नई दुनिया बनाने का जुनून फिर हम पे छाया है. जिंदाबाद. Thank you.
thank you.